A Brush With is sponsored by Bloomberg Connects, the arts and culture app. Created by Bloomberg philanthropies, Bloomberg Connects lets you access museums, galleries and cultural spaces around the world on demand. Download the app to access digital guides and explore a variety of content. Hello, I'm Ben Luke and welcome to A Brush With, the podcast from the Art Newspaper in which I talk to artists about their influences, from writers to musicians, filmmakers and of course other artists, and the cultural experiences that have shaped their lives and work. And in this episode it's a brush with Eva Rothschild, who has a profound sense of the unique qualities and particular power of her discipline, sculpture. Although Eva's art clearly relates to the history of abstraction and modernism, it balances a reverence and deep curiosity for sculpture history with a playfulness and subversion. In her sculptures, time-honoured avant-garde principles meet the forms and practices of popular culture. Born of much instinctive experimentation in the studio, Eva's work engages often exuberantly with diverse sculptural processes, from casting and welding to stacking and balancing, and properties from weight and solidity to patina, texture and colour. As well as exploring gallery space in often unexpected ways, Eva has developed a rich seam of public sculpture with major permanent works, including a playground in East London. Eva was born in Dublin in 1971 and now lives and works in London, where we met for this conversation as she prepared for a show at the Modern Art Gallery in the UK capital, opening in September 2024. She began her studies in the Irish capital but moved to Belfast for her degree, and it was there, as we'll hear, that she was introduced to contemporary art that profoundly shaped her practice. She went on to study at Goldsmiths College in London but moved to Glasgow at the end of the 1990s. There she became involved in the dynamic scene that's produced dozens of the most radical and distinctive artists in Britain over the past 3 decades. Many of them, like Eva, were on the committee of the now legendary Glaswegian artist-run space Transmission. In Glasgow, she made some of her key early sculptures, like NGO from 2002, a group of hanging forms, not unlike a cluster of heads, fashioned from strips of leather in 4 different colours. She also began making more angular forms in black painted wood. Misfit from 2003 looks almost like a drawing emerging from the wall, with jostling triangular shapes interwoven with rings of braided leather. Pieces like this mark the beginning of Eva's investigation of the colour black, a preoccupation that, as we'll hear, is ongoing today. It also set her on a path of developing multiple sculptural languages, a lexicon of forms to which she returns, embellishing her strands of making with each new iteration. The leatherworks grew steadily more complex, often leading to sculptures that seemed to defy gravity, like High Times from 2004 and Higher Love from 2007. The latter is formed from hoops in gradations of white, red and black, which seem to hover weightlessly in the gallery space or be held up improbably by nothing but loose fringes of leather in the same colours. The more geometric structures also expanded in multiple directions, the summit of which was Cold Corners, Eva's 2009 project for the Juveen Galleries at Tate Britain, in which she seemed to draw sculpturally through and around those neoclassical sandstone halls using powder-coated aluminium rods. The 2000s were a period of prolific innovation. Eva developed a series of sculptures which resemble branches or forked lightning, which again often seemed to defy the laws of physics in their display. She created forms that resembled hollowed out or porous stones, playing on surface and interiority and introducing spray paint as a new texture. She took the momentary random shape of a doodle or squiggle and made strangely alluring and dense sculptures. She experimented with mosaic surfaces, and with the work Nefertiti from 2009, she built tall stacks of solid bioresin and jesmonite vessels. In the years since, these distinct groups have been brought into productive conversation in installations. This is core to Eva's strategy. The different character of her sculptures means that she can choreograph mise-en-scène in which a 3-dimensional dialogue ensues. So, while she's absolutely concerned with making individual objects, she's equally preoccupied by space and how her works engage with it, and inevitably us, the people who experience them and walk among them in the gallery or the public realm. It's been fascinating to see the way that Eva has harnessed this relationship between the viewer, the artwork and the environment. She's created furniture that sits at the heart of her shows. For many years, she's made screen-like pieces that form a porous barrier through the space and frame other works. She's created resin blocks cast from lumps of polystyrene that are carefully assembled and embellished with sweeps of spray paint, but also evoke the casual clusters of waste found on urban streets. And she's made a series of concrete structures that reference the anti-terror barriers found in in the modern metropolis, which she decorates with geometric shapes that conjure modernist design and the baffle patterns used in camouflage. Even though she's essentially concerned with abstraction, observed reality never feels far away from her forms. In tandem with these examples of the blunter and tougher seams of her practice, she's also pushed her finer, more linear sculptures into ever more complex arrangements. In an array from 2016 and hangouts from 2018, she assembles tableaux of multiple elements on platforms and seems to probe the nature of positive and negative space. And in recent years, she's made beautiful, apparently informal shapes constructed from corrugated tubular units in opaque resin, plaster and gesso, painted in hues that notably diverge from her long-established palette of bright colours into pastels and more subtle shades. Whenever you enter Eva's exhibitions, you sense her fascination with the physicality of sculpting and pushing the physical stuff that comprises her work into new territory. And it's this with which I began our conversation. What's it like to experience what she's described as the material giddiness of making?
Well, I suppose it's like being immersed in something, immersed in kind of the possibility of the studio and what it can allow you to be able to make to kind of communicate outside the studio. Yeah, just like a sort of, that you have possibilities to create and to sort of draw on things. And so being in the studio is really good because it's like, I think especially if you have a studio that you've kind of bedded into, I suppose. I've had to move studios a few times, so you can really make it sort of the most conducive to thinking and making, which is essentially like what I suppose we do as artists, well, what I do as an artist. So it's a bit like, you know, when you are on a train and you're looking out the window and everything's going past, but maybe if you were standing out there in the landscape, you wouldn't have that experience of the kind of wholeness or possibility of the landscape. But obviously looking at the landscape is quite sort of passive, but in a way that sort of thing of the possibilities of the studio and the materials and perhaps the accumulated drawings, the accumulated ephemera that is things you made that didn't work, things you made but put aside, like a kind of visual and a sort of material history. It's like being within that where you can sort of kind of grab from all your references in one place. So, I mean, sometimes it leads to nothing, but at other times you just get like a sense of, I could, you know, expand. I could bring these things into work, into being.
And can you quite quickly leap between very different materials, as in grab a particular material, work with that for a short period and move on to another, or are you very concentrated in the way that you work?
No,
with
I would say
materials?
like, I mean, it's always the moving from material to material as well. You know, what I like about that is there's also the sort of practical side of things, like, and part of being, I suppose, a sculptor, part of it I like is the kind of application of the sort of practical to the artistic, to the absurd, to the esoteric, to the romantic, because even to make the most absurd, surrealist, romantic, whatever sculpture you'd want to do, you'd still have to, you know, get out your toolbox, or, you know, you still have to mix up the materials in the same ratio, or, and that's the process, you know, and the process then, I suppose, gives you the latitude to think while you make, in a way that's like, yeah, like a kind of immersive process.
One of the things I really like about what you've said about sculpture is about the importance of sculpture in the age of the screen.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That tactility, that three-dimensionality, the way that it occupies space and forces you to engage with space, right? That's that's enormously important in your work.
Yeah, and more than ever, you know, like I think everything's being replaced by a kind of homogenized mode of accessibility, and sculpture isn't. And things we do with our body aren't. Running isn't, swimming isn't, sculpture isn't. You know, whereas so many other things are being kind of sort of flattened out to fit a format. And I think that for a while you could feel maybe like, oh, sculpture, like what does, it's a terrible sort of position to be in, but it's actually not, because it's like, it's not transferable. Actually, it's not a transferable skill. Right. Oh, fantastic.
Do you also sort of actively resist too much pictorial quality in your work as well?
Well, I mean, I don't think my work is particularly pictorial. I guess it's not representational. There's sometimes objects that are clearly from the world, you know, cast objects often. Yeah, there's very few things that are a sort of nameable picture beyond, say, something like a geometric shape or something. So, I wouldn't say I actively resist it. I just would say that's kind of integral to my mode of working, that it isn't about narrative or representation. But then equally, the photographic image of the work always interests me, how the work is in a photograph or how it isn't, how a two-dimensional image can or cannot describe the work and how it differs from the work. And actually that's the thing that is, I suppose, great about painting, sculpture, about the experience of seeing art, is that it differs from the picture. It's not the same, you know?
Do you take pictures of the work as you're making it in a way to test that?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I do because I have a phone. But let's say I didn't have a phone, I wouldn't be getting out my camera.
Right.
Yeah.
Got you.
So I do it because that's easy to do now. It's the same as like, yeah, would I call a friend during the day if I had to go to a phone box? No, you know?
Right.
So, yeah, it's become like breathing, hasn't it?
Right,
So,
exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But I guess what I'm getting at is you wouldn't like take a picture of the work, see how it's working as a two-dimensional image and then adjust the work accordingly.
No. Actually, there is one point where that is quite useful. It's just if you're trying to get distance from a work. Yeah, I mean, this is just a really pragmatic thing. If you're making something and you can't see it from all sides, you can put it on something and turn it and take a picture from each side and maybe check it out like that. But that's like a kind of a function of making rather than a particularly photographic pursuit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You talked about the resistance of narrative, or rather just the fact that there is no clear narrative element to the work. But one of the things I think is really interesting about the work is how it clearly does use sources from the real world.
Yeah, it's associative, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so for instance, there's street furniture, there's
Yeah.
barriers that, you know, very clearly being made with works like Hazard, for instance, where you clearly see that connection, but you're not illustrating. And I think that's the key point, isn't it?
No, I suppose it's relating it to life, you know? Yeah, I feel like the titles and everything are pretty important because, you know, it's a really different thing if you have like, I don't know, a stack of objects and you call it stack 2, or if you call it Hazard, you know? And that sense of bringing language to the work is really important. And also I think it's really important to a viewer because, you know, obviously we want to find meaning and we want to find like a kind of a way into things, you know, and the title can signpost. For me, the idea of a didactic or descriptive title is less interesting than something that maybe sort of sends you in a different direction. So,
I like the idea that I think you expressed before, which was about opening up space around the work through titles.
Yeah. So I used to get so frustrated when I was younger. I go and see a show and you're like, oh my God, that's amazing. Oh, Untitled 4, you know, and you're like, oh, okay. You know, it's like, and it's fine, you know, but it's not for me. Yeah.
No, right.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the way that you work in the studio, one aspect that it seems to me is a very contemporary attitude and a very important attitude in terms of contemporary making is the use of leftovers. Mm-hmm. That is to say, nothing is wasted in the studio.
Well, I try not to.
Yeah, but it's crucial in terms of ideas as well, right? In terms of almost the unconscious idea emerging through the leftovers.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder, you know, there's certain artists who I suppose you're friends with and you talk to them about it. And I think that sense of what the studio allows, you know, as we spoke about at the beginning, is that sense of an accumulation of things that may not seem significant at the time. You know, it's like taking something out of the back of the wardrobe you forgot was there and suddenly it's the right thing, you know? And it's funny, I don't accumulate objects. I'm not a big keeper of things at home. I'm happy to get rid of stuff. You know, I read on a Kindle. I don't want all the books beside my bed. But that sense of the studio of like, oh, this broken cast of something might be useful at some point. You know, there's points where you have to maybe sort of clear the decks. And actually my whole mode of making is kind of episodic and cumulative. I tend not to make things that are, what would you call, like singular objects. They tend to be made of things that maybe stack or pile or are joined together or a chain, or it's an additive process generally. So I suppose having the kind of extra bits and pieces, or it's like the leftovers, as you say, of sort of other works, you know, they find their place. And actually they kind of generally do find a place, you know. I think you really know if something's just like, oh, just get rid of it. So you don't keep everything, but yeah. Mm-hmm.
In terms of colour, it seems to me that there's a really interesting relationship that your work has with the colour, or perhaps you don't define it as a colour, black. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I like the way you've talked about black as almost more as a material.
Yeah, I would say so, definitely. It's something that allows definition, and then it can also allow a kind of dispersal of definition if you use it with a reflective surface. So if the work's appreciated by the eye and the body, and you consider those things, you know, the eye and how the eye looks at an artwork and tries to understand the physicality of that artwork, can be either disturbed or can be confused or defined through the use of a strong colour like black. I also use red and green and a certain shade of sort of a lilac-y purple as well, quite a lot, because with those it's very much about making a kind of inequality of tone so that they don't grab the eye or pull the eye towards them in a way that, you know, maybe another colour might. So I think a sense of tonality, and I think in the more recent works where I've used really pale colours, I've used quite a lot of gradient within them, again, as a sort of almost like something that I suppose attempts to form a trick of sort of dematerialization of the object. And I feel that the black is the most interesting in relation to that because it can do both depending on the nature of the surface finish.
Right. And also the nature of the form, in the sense that you can have that wonderful sense with so many of your works where it feels like you're drawing around the space. It feels like it's a line and it's negotiating with the space.
Well, I think that sense of negative space in the work is always of interest to me. Like, I've made quite a lot of public sculpture, and one of the things with those public sculptures that I always am focused on is that they should be porous in a way, that they shouldn't be blocking the space. They should be creating space within the environment or creating a series of encounters with the environment that changes it or allows you to relate to it in a different way. So therefore they have to have kind of an openness to you as the sort of body who, especially in terms of public work, really has no choice about whether the work is there or not. I mean, obviously there's consultations and things, but it's not like you have the contract where you go to the gallery, you go to the theatre and you say, I am here to engage with this. And so I think that's really interesting as well. And I am interested in that really quite strongly.
While you're on the subject of public sculpture, one of the interesting things about making sculpture in an open space like that, of course, is that you have the infinity of the sky, and it seems to me that you've used height really interesting.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's just a great opportunity, isn't it? It's like to not be bounded is, it's exciting, you know? And I think to make things that allow a level of activity, like I made that playground. Yeah. That was kind of amazing to be able to make that and to think about who the users of that would be, you know, and the different ways they might use it. I think it's really interesting with public sculpture as well, the way, especially, I guess, living in such an urban environment, living in London, is you see how much, and I suppose that does inform quite a lot of the pieces, like the hazard pieces, which I guess sort of came in some ways from the kind of hazard architecture, which is what I call it, that's deployed to coerce behaviour within the city, and, you know, the ways that people adapt the objects in their environment, you know, like street furniture. Playgrounds are really interesting as well because obviously they're used by all these different groups at different times of the day. I find that really interesting how they're used by kind of older teenagers and things in the ways that, you know, they're not for them, but why not, you know? That's sort of, I guess, the kind of hacking of something to be used in a different way by different viewers or users, you know. It's the same with people who come to see art, you know, people see things differently. Right. And the idea of sitting on a work, we're conducting this interview with a work, a piece of furniture that you made in front of us. Yeah. But you've also done seating, bespoke seating, as it were. And it's interesting because in a way it's similar to what you were just saying about public sculpture, in a way that you want the engagement to be different to that kind of quick look that so many people do when they go to a gallery. They'll glance, almost browse, the look from the door. Yeah, it's like the deathly look from the door, you know. Head in, seen it, leave. Yeah. You know? Yeah, I always make seating in my exhibitions. I actually don't think I'm making any in this one. That's also because I have actually loads here, so I can just bring it because it's a kind of downtime thing to do. You can just it's nice to have those practices that you can do if you're sort of, sometimes you just feel like, you know, and actually having a kind of job to do, like casting up some stools or some benches is kind of a practice in itself, in a way to start thinking about making while making and thinking. But yeah, having something like seating or, you know, somewhere somebody can put their stuff that actually is made out of the same material as the sculptures, it gives people access to the materiality in a way that then makes them perhaps, you know, I mean, this is what I hope. I don't know what people think. But like, if you sit down on a bench and you're looking at an artwork and the bench is not what you expected, and you start to maybe think about the materiality of that, and you start to realize its relationship to the objects you're looking at, well, hopefully it gives you a kind of a way in, and also maybe raises some questions and creates a sort of a sense of, yeah, people use the word participation or interactive. Somebody asked me in an interview one time, they said, is your work interactive? And you're like, well, you're looking at it, you know, it's like, what do you want to press a button? You know, it's like that sense of like, what isn't interactive?
Right.
You know?
But it's a bodily interaction, isn't it?
Yeah, and also
by
it's
sitting
not
on
like,
it, you become aware of your body in relation to it.
Yeah, and also the other thing is, of course, you can then privilege a view, you know, and, you know, I find like with my work, you know, often it can be maybe quite hostile looking in some ways. But by having sort of substructure within that, which can be as simple as seating or a framework or somewhere to leave your stuff or whatever, you're saying this work itself may not be inviting, but actually there's an invitation to engage with it. You know, it's not about subject of the work or anything, but yeah, it's for you, you know.
Let's move on to the questions that we ask all our guests. Who was the first artist whose work you loved?
So it was seeing, and I just bought this. This is the book.
It's the Tutankamen catalogue from the British Museum show.
In 1972, yeah. Right. So my father, who is a keen amateur historian, so I was born in 71, and in 72 he made like a trip to London to see this from Dublin, which at that point involved like getting the ferry, getting the train. It was quite a big thing to do. And he brought back this catalogue. And from as young as I can remember, this catalogue was, I was like obsessed with it and obsessed with the images in it. And it really just stayed with me, you know. So actually, in a funny way, that was really the thing that first grabbed my attention. And it is interesting thinking back on it now that, they're sculptures, the things that were in it that grabbed my attention. So, that.
Extraordinary. I had the same catalogue around me when I was a child at home because my mother did exactly the same as your father.
Okay, yeah.
And that idea of wonderful things, the famous quote,
wonderful
really
things.
Stuck with me.
Yeah,
the
me
idea
too.
that there were wonderful things that were seen and observed, and you know, aside from the politics of it all, which is so much more problematic.
And
now
also
than
the
it's
sort
been
of
then,
macabre side of it. Was there a curse? And you know, that whole thing just totally appealed to me. That it was a little bit scary and and I think as well the sort of religious nature of the imagery as well, you know, was really interesting to me. Sort of, you know, obviously I grew up in Ireland, it's a very kind of Catholic country. You know, you're very familiar with the gold and the ways of depicting the sacred, and this was something completely different.
Right.
But also within that same idiom of the kind of idea of sacredness, and that the object was a way into some other world or something. So it really just, you know, I didn't interrogate how I felt about it at the time, but I have enduringly kind of loved that, you know.
A completely different experience that I know that you had when you were quite young too, which I'm sort of envious of because I wonder what I would have thought when I experienced this. Christo, yes.
That was
so you
huge
saw
as
the
well.
Mails' film about Christo and Jean-Claude doing this extraordinary work, which is called
Valley Curtain.
Valley Curtain, there you go. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so I mean, I've no idea of how I saw that. So obviously at that point there was 4 TV channels in Ireland. When I think of those 4 TV channels, I cannot think in any way why it was on them, when it was on them, why it was, the whole thing was on it. But I just was watching TV and this crazy film came on about these people doing this completely mad thing. And I remember quite clearly watching it and sort of having no understanding of like what the motivation would be, but being completely fascinated by what they were doing and the result of it. And then the fact that it was only there for like, I don't know, it was a really short time. Maybe it was a day or something. I can't remember. But like the way it was filmed and everything with all these people, you know, sort of working together, sort of, you know, pointing and sort of talking in earnest. And then it would flash back to the drawings of it and the way it's edited and everything. And it just, it took me years before I knew what it was. It was one of those things you'd say to people, you'd be like, did you see that weird film? You know, and people would be like, yeah, I saw it. What was it? You know, because there was no
used to be on Channel
context.
4
But we didn't have Channel 4. You know, there was no Channel 4.
Which historical artist do you turn to the most?
So I'm going to talk about like very recent history, I guess. Like, so obviously we've gone through my love for the ancient world, you know, so I keep going back to that. But I guess like Barbara Hepworth has always been a big touchstone for me. You know, and Henry Moore, you know, it sounds very kind of almost sort of basic to say that, but I do think those were the sort of first kind of works that, you know, while I encountered Christo and obviously through books encountered whatever ancient works, those are the first works you were sort of like, you could see, like, say, somewhere like even in Dublin. I can't think of a specific incidence of seeing those works, but something that actually was abstract. And I could see the links between those works, say, back towards the works of antiquity. And, you know, I think pieces like Henry Moore's The Helmet series, you know, and then, you know, obviously that leads to then Brancusi also. And that sense of, especially with Brancusi, I mean, you know, you don't have to be rocket science to see the connections between his way of making and how I'm interested in episodic form. And then with Hepworth as well, you know, and it was interesting that she was a woman as well, seen on these terms, you know, again, probably that really makes a difference to me to see that she achieved all of that at that moment. You know, she had large family, all of those things, you know, but the work itself, you know, I remember seeing the Magic Stones piece, which is a very small piece at Kettle's Yard, you know, and it just sort of sent me in a different direction. And then I did the show at the Hepworth Wakefield, and that engagement with the plasters and everything there was really exciting. And I was in a show there was this really great group show called The Dark Monarch at St. Ives.
Tate St. Ives. Yeah.
While we were installing that, the guy who was helping me install my work was the caretaker of the ballroom, the Palais de Danse, which was her studio. And I was just chatting with him, and he was like, I can take you there to have a look, you know. And I think it's all been sort of museumified now. I don't know, because I haven't been to Cornwall since. But at that point, everything was really pretty untouched in there, and we went in, and it was like the Tutankamen moment. It was like wonderful things, you know. There was sketchbooks, there was her Labour Party membership, there was the drawing on the floor for the piece for the United Nations. Yeah, and it was like this sort of really amazing moment of sort of a kind of personal connection with that. So yeah, I would say Hepworth is somebody who perhaps I don't look at her so much now, but certainly has been an artist who I sort of turned to, and Brancusi as well, I would say.
It's interesting you talk about the ancient world and those kind of modernist artists, because there's a piece by you called Nefertiti.
Oh, yeah.
Which clearly evokes Brancusi, but of course has the name of an ancient figure. So was that a deliberate attempt to make that connection?
No, but the reason it's called Nefertiti is because those pieces are these like truncated cones. And you know the famous bust of Nefertiti in the Berlin Staatsmuseum, is it?
Yeah.
The form at the top mimics the headpiece of Nefertiti.
Right.
So while I was making them, I was thinking all the time of this headpiece of Nefertiti, so that's why it's called Nefertiti.
Right, but it's that essential volume, if you like, but that relates to both Brancusi
and also
to
how
that
it's sort of, if you see that bust of Nefertiti, it's like how it abstracts the body in a way, you know. It's a bit like thinking about the Henry Moore helmets. It's like they change our perception of the head-body connection.
Absolutely. One of the most regular references that comes up in relation to your work is minimalism, and particularly some of the figures that are on the outskirts of minimalism, people like John McCracken and others. Mm-hmm. How much is that a direct reference? How much is McCracken an important figure for you? Because, of course, one of the key things is we were talking about the shiny black surfaces that appear, and that shine in his work is obviously the kind of key.
Yeah, so
quality.
I'd say when I was younger, he would have been a real reference for me. And like you say, the kind of outliers of minimalism. I think I was very taken by their sort of more esoteric take on it, that it was like what I sort of call like a kind of magic minimalism. It presented itself formally, the work, but the thinking around it was a kind of magical thinking or a romantic thinking or what I would call an expansive way of thinking. And so when I first came to making sculpture, which was very tentative actually, because really I mainly did printmaking. I went to university in Belfast, and I don't know, it felt like I had to sort of choose something to do, and so I ended up doing printmaking, and it was very unconnected from the rest of the world at that time. It was very insular. There wasn't much from the outside, so the only things we were really seeing were like art forum would arrive every now and again. and there's an Irish art magazine called Circa, which was around then.
Yeah.
So it's like you were trying to learn what are your markers. It's like now if you want to hear a tune, you can go through Spotify,
Yeah.
but then you'd have to go to a record shop, look at all the covers, maybe listen to 5 different like radio shows and go, oh, that sound, who's that? And then you'd have to wait to see where they're going to say who the record was, all of that kind of thing. And it was a bit the same with art, but like, imagine that's like, minus a million. It was like, where could you find this stuff? People would say contemporary and they'd be like, Andy Warhol. And you'd be like, yeah, not quite, And so it was really so hard to find things. And I think that sort of somebody like, say, McCracken, Irwin, or whatever, they kind of would creep in,
So you'd learn about their work through reproduction in a way.
Oh, yeah. I
Than
I don't know if I've
yeah.
ever seen any. I mean, I have actually. I've seen them when I've been showing in New York.
Yeah.
But there's the Ulster Museum, which had like some artworks and then like a display about a giant squid. It was so hard for people to understand. Your peers at the art school and your teachers at the art school was your art world, you know? And then actually one of the things that happened, which I think probably sort of makes a difference to your next question, was that one of the teachers there went to Documenta and they brought back the catalogue from Documenta. It must have been, I don't know which years it's on, but it had Cady Noland's work
I think it would
in
be
it.
92.
92, yeah, because I finished in 93, and it had Cady Noland's work in it. And I remember going for a tutorial, and this catalogue was on her desk, and I was like, oh, can I look at this? I mean, no one had thought of it as a teaching resource to go, everyone, have a look at this is happening. But I remember looking through it, and I was literally like, hang on a minute here. Now this is what I'm interested in. And there was that sense of like, oh, there is this way of making that's kind of got a hardness and it's like you're reaching. And seeing that had a really profound effect on me. And it sort of brought together a lot of those things around a kind of realising an interest in a sort of hardcore kind of making.
Yeah.
But sort of that wasn't just around the sort of minimal object, perhaps. But it still took me a long time to get to a point where I felt I could make an object and say, this is what I do. I was still very kind of hesitant about that, probably due to a lack of confidence in making,
But there's a terrific economy about Cady Noland's work. As you say, you've preempted the kind of contemporary artist question,
Yeah,
but it's
sorry.
great. Let's talk more about
But
her.
there's other contemporary artists, but because it's funny, I almost feel like she's historical because she made a choice.
Yeah.
I always hope that Cady Noland is doing a Duchamp and making her version of Étant Donné when no one's looking at it, nobody knows she's doing it, and she's going to suddenly present this extraordinary new artwork at some point.
I just wish she'd let people see her work more. I made the pilgrimage and I went to see her show in Frankfurt.
Right.
Similar to my dad going to see the Tutankamen show. And there was no catalogue. That's kind of great though, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the economy, as I say, that I think is so amazing. It deals with massive issues.
And the brutality.
Yeah, the directness is extraordinary.
And I mean, talk about something finding its moment.
Yeah.
That work is the most on point work at the moment. You couldn't have anticipated that it would find its moment and be as perfect for the times we find ourselves in.
In terms of other contemporary artists, it seems to me that David Hammond's might be important to you.
Oh, I do like David Hammond's work. I hadn't actually had him on my list, but yeah, I mean, I love, again, the economy in his work, the communicative desire within the work, and also just the way it looks, because that also gets overlooked all the time because people are like, why do you do this? Why do you do that? I mean, a lot of the time you make things because you want to see how they look,
Yeah.
So I think him, and then Kathy Wilkes is another person who I feel like our work is very different, but for me, I find the kind of tenderness and the narrative she can bring into, and the economy again of her work, I find really enduringly fascinating.
And again, leaping between different modes of making and forms of making and so on.
And the sort of the brittleness of the work, I think, is really interesting. Yeah, she's somebody I really like as well.
With Hammond's, you made a piece called Higher Love.
Yeah.
Is that kind of a direct homage to his piece called Higher Goals,
But
which
no,
is
obviously
telephone poles with basketball hoops at the top?
they're too high.
Yeah.
And
and
for
then
anyone.
an amazing public
Yeah.
art piece in New York. And then this piece that you did is, a tall piece with rings at the top,
The
not
rings,
basketball hoops, but
they're kind of sporty looking, which I find the sort of paraphernalia of sports really interesting as well. The sort of, especially the masculinity around those objects. Obviously I was aware of his work and I felt like the rings had a sort of something in common. So yeah, I was aware of that. You know, I made another work which was similar to that, I think, called High Times as well, which, you know, I suppose relates to, there was a kind of stoner magazine called High Times as well. And that, I think at that time in the work, there was a sort of tactile quality that maybe related to sort of specific countercultural kind of elements. And, you know, the leather work comes in and out of the work. I never feel like any material's sort of finished, you know, there's always possibility of a presence or whatever, but yeah, so there was the High Times, Higher Love, but also, you know, there's the song Higher Love, that sense of looking up as well.
And there's also sort of hopefulness, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you know, I always used to think there was a terrific joy in your work, and it still continues. Of course, there is a rootedness in a kind of serious tackling of all sorts of subjects, not least sculptural subjects, but there is pleasure to be had in your work.
Yeah, well, I like making it, you know. So, yeah, no, I think, there should be. And because I like to try and get a balance between a sort of austerity and a kind of generosity towards the viewer. And that generosity doesn't have to be about laying everything out, but it should be that, that sense that, it, you know, it is there to be seen, to be interacted with, to be present, is really important to me. And certainly for me, until something leaves the studio, it is really just a studio. Once it's out, you know.
A Brush With is sponsored by Bloomberg Connects, the arts and culture app. The free app offers access to more than 500 cultural organisations through a single download, with new guides being added regularly. The latest editions are as diverse as the Ingram collection of modern British art in the UK, Tokyo City View in the Japanese capital, and the Alinari Foundation in Florence, dedicated to Italian and international photography. Among the other guides on the app are several organisations that have shown and collected Eva Rothschild's work, from Tate to the Hepworth Wakefield and The Line, the public art project in East London. Download Bloomberg Connects and you'll see that the guide to The Line has audio content in which Eva discusses her work for the project, Living Spring, made in 2011. One of her sculptures made from metal tubes with alternating bands of bright colour and black. The guide has details of all the other works on the trail, including 2 sound pieces by a former guest on A Brush With, Larry Achampong. You can hear the works on the app alongside Larry's audio commentary. To explore digital guides to all the partnering institutions, download the app today. It's available from the App Store and Google Play, and you can keep up to date by following Bloomberg Connects on Facebook and Instagram.
What do you have pinned to the studio wall? We're actually in your studio, so I have a bit of insight into this.
Yeah, you've got the complete picture. Yeah, well, one of the things you would have to sort of say about the studio is there isn't that much wall space because things are piled up against the wall everywhere. So there isn't really that much wall space. I do have a small clear spot in front of my desk. So at my desk, I'm be interested to know how many artists in the world have this picture on their wall. The Rafters of Medusa.
Mm-hmm. By Jericho.
By Jericho. And I have The Death of Marat by David. I have some drawings of my own because I draw a lot. I tend to draw as I'm planning things and as I'm thinking. So I've got quite a few drawings of sort of works that, I don't know, they maybe haven't happened yet, or they're something that recurs. You know, I think all artists have a thing they kind of draw in a recurring way. So I have some of those recurring drawings.
They sort of nag at you.
Yeah, yeah. But also they're like a comfort. You know, you can open the sketchbook and you can draw this. You know, you draw this and you draw this on this and you draw that and that, and then you draw something else, you know.
Yeah.
So I have that, and I have some stickers of some Cycladic figures that somebody gave me, which I find are just the right size to use as a stand-in for a person if you do a model at 1:20 scale. Uh-huh. So that's quite nice to use. And I have this photograph as well, which is from a photojournalist, and I've done quite a lot of research into trying to find out who it is by because I've lost the reference and I can't seem to find it anywhere else online. And the copy I have of it is really bad, but it's of a woman who is a refugee, and she is holding a scarf over her head, and the scarf has circles on it. And the large dot of the scarf seems to replace her face.
Yeah.
And she has a tattoo on her hand, which is of rosary beads. And it's just one of those images that just completely pulled me, like, sort of stopped me in my tracks.
It almost does look like a kind of one of those 18th century sculptures
Yes.
of veiled women or something. That kind of a strange,
it's an incredible
almost
image.
macabre image
Yeah,
in a way.
and it has this religious quality because, of course, of the tattoo of the rosary on her hand. So, yeah, that image has followed me through lots of different desks and studios, yeah.
Right. You've got all sorts of models around.
Yes,
It's
yes.
delicious, I have to say, being in this studio, because all around us are ideas. It's just teeming with ideas. So is that about something you've got in your mind, you want to have it around because it's nagging at you, and then you can draw on it when you need to, sort of thing?
Yeah, also, I mean, it's both of those things. So obviously making sculpture is quite, especially making sculpture that has to do all the things that it needs to do, like stand up, not fall on someone and kill them, which is always a worry as a sculptor. All of those things are the kind of constraints of sculpture, and they're also the problem solving. One of the people who I didn't mention in my sort of, artists I look at is Phila de Barlow, who gave me my first job at teaching sculpture and was therefore the first person who ever really said, I was applying for the job. I didn't actually realize it would be in sculpture. And also we worked together closely for lots of years and had lots of talks, as you do when you're teaching, which is one of the kind of pleasures of teaching, that you actually get time to talk with people about work. So with making models, and one of the things Phila would talk about so much in some of the amazing videos and interviews that everyone is now so glad that she got the chance to record, as we miss her so much. She would talk about how you kind of bring things together to make them. And we make in quite different ways, but there's also that sense that you kind of have to test things out to know what you can do and what you can't do. And sometimes you can proceed with something that you think you can't do or won't work because you kind of build that in. You're like, okay, well, something will happen, and then there's other things that you're like, okay, this totally won't happen, so we need to look at this another way. So they have both a practical and a sort of artistic and imaginative function. But I think, as a sculptor, like I say, I draw, but to make models or, I make them from wire, plaster, clay, I cast things, to be making them it's just the extension of drawing. It's like how you have to deal with the three-dimensional space. And then also they inform, everything. They're like a library of forms.
Which museum or gallery do you visit most frequently?
So I wouldn't say most frequently, but in terms of if I could visit them the most frequently, I would say the Fortuny Museum in Venice and maybe the Brancusi Studio in Paris. And I think with both of those locations, I think what I really love about them, the John Soanes Museum in London is one as well, is that they aren't just a museum of rarefied objects, although the objects in them are very rarefied. They're a kind of record of a life of making. So with an artist studio museum, I mean, that's sort of obvious. But say with the Fortuny, what I really love about the Fortuny, I think about it quite a lot actually, the way people engaged with making before we were in the age of mechanical reproduction. So the sense that this guy, Fortuny, he would travel on his grand tour or whatever, and then he would paint pictures of the places, and then those pictures are the pictures that are there, like we'd take a phone picture or something.
Yeah.
The idea of the level of engagement visually and physically with the world and the sort of commitment to that even when I think of older relations of mine, like my great aunt and things, who was an artist, they would go somewhere and they would draw it, and they would sit there and they'd go to places in Ireland even, and they'd do a sketch of it, Yeah. And I love in the Fortuny Museum that sense of curiosity of the man, that he designed the crazy stage sets and obviously the fabrics, the fashions, but also just these intimate portraits of places he'd been, and then he loved opera, so he did all these paintings of Parsifal. I was there recently and they sort of changed it a bit, and I was a little bit disappointed. But I remember going there because it wasn't open when I did Venice. It's often closed that week, the show's open. And I remember going back with my oldest son, who I think was maybe 13 or 14 at the time. And I was like, we have to go here, and it was already quite a fractious trip. And we went there and he was like, and I was like, well, just sit. And they used to have these sofas there as well, which again, they don't seem to have anymore. And they were sort of along the end. So you could just sit there, which again is something I love. So, I was like, oh, well, if you don't want to see it, just sit there and look at your phone, whatever. And, I was like, this is amazing. I love this. I love that this person did this. It's exceeded all my expectations. And then there was this room with these paintings from Parsifal and the overture to the opera Parsifal playing the Good Friday music. And I actually had this sort of kind of weak moment where I was like completely overcome by this sort of like experience. And I went out and I was like, come and see this. It's amazing. And he was like lying there watching Narcos on his phone. And I was just like, okay, back to the real world, but it was this like, actually there's something in the synthesis of everything in that museum that just, I'd be happy to spend a lot of time there.
Which cultural experience changed the way you see the world?
So that's the kind of weird one because everything changes the way you see the world, from year to year. But I suppose if we were relating it to being an artist, I would say that going to Glasgow was probably, and going to Belfast, leaving home, I grew up in Dublin. I love Dublin. I go there many, many times every year. But I was always someone who wanted to, get out and sort of be somewhere else and be independent. And going to Belfast was a kind of, for anyone outside of Ireland, I guess quite an odd choice at that time. But, just taking that step out to being an independent person and being in a different environment, encountering different things was really important. And then I would say one of the really key things that really, I would say, changed everything for me and also gave me the latitude, I think, to become an artist and to feel almost kind of permitted to making the next steps, and that was moving to Glasgow and starting to work at Transmission Gallery.
Yeah.
And making the connections with the people who are still, really a big part of my life. Kirsty Ogg, the curator, Toby Webster from the Modern Institute, Will Bradley, who runs, I think, Kunsthal Oslo now. And sort of finding that like-minded group of people.
Was it just the reputation that Glasgow had at the time that took you there? Because you didn't study there, did you?
No, I didn't. And I think the one place that Belfast was connected with was Glasgow. There was always a big backwards and forwards. That Larne to Stranraer ferry was, a sort of commuter route back. So a lot of people studied in Glasgow and then came and did their MA in Belfast. I mean, Cathy Wilkes did that. One time I was getting the ferry back and I met Ross Sinclair, the artist, and I think our ferry was delayed for probably God knows how many hours with the weather. In the winter, it would get delayed. And just talking to him, and then when I went to Glasgow, meeting people there. And, Glasgow is really so known as such a dynamic city for art. And at that point, coming from Belfast, where, people were doing things, but it wasn't as connected to a kind of wider art scene. Making the decision to go to Glasgow then, after leaving, finishing my degree, my husband's mother was from Glasgow. One of my friends from college was moving back to Glasgow. So it was quite a natural move, but it was really pivotal in creating that community, and becoming part of a community of people who were really serious about wanting to do this, Yes, have a studio. It wasn't like just going back and moving back to Dublin. And sort of meeting people who were so motivated by doing things themselves. And I just really fell into that. And, those are still enduring, relationships. I was there last week. Yeah.
Which writers or poets do you return to?
Yeah, so I had a real problem with this because I am a kind of almost obsessive reader. I just read anything really fast, sort of almost in a kind of like you'd watch TV. So I find a lot of things just sort of rolls over me. And also I have the really bad habit now, which I realised has changed my reading experience, which is I read on a Kindle, so I don't accumulate too much stuff. And I do find that it has a huge effect. And I think people find this about music as well, that you just jump from things, you know, and you don't have that tactile experience of holding the book and having the cover and looking at and remembering what was in it. So sometimes I just completely forget what I've read.
Yeah.
So I read and read and read and read. I almost sort of, as well, the Kindle sort of satisfies that desire, which I think I always had growing up, was being left somewhere without a book, you know, in some holiday house in like the west of Ireland, and you'd have finished your book. What were you going to read? Like your father's military history books, you know? So the Kindle sort of is my dream object. So I would say I return to my Kindle again and again.
We talked about titles earlier on.
Yeah.
But will you take notes whilst reading and think, oh, that's a nice title?
Sometimes, yeah. I get that more from speech, actually. And actually particularly from going to see live music, I find, is a really big source of thinking about art for me. That kind of moment when you're sort of fully engaged in that. I find that being in that moment is very useful in relation to thinking about those things.
That's a very nice segue to the next question, which is, what music or other audio do you listen to while you're in the studio?
So, I mean, in the studio day to day, I listen to just a lot of the radio background, BBC 6, BBC 4, you know, BBC 3, any of those. But yeah, in terms of music, I mean, I really like rock music. So I, like many people of my age, tend not to listen to that much new stuff. So yeah, I listen to a lot of Sonic Youth, Smashing Pumpkins, Van Morrison I return to over and over again. I think there's certain Dinosaur Jr. albums I've played. You know, if they were on vinyl, they would have worn out. I do like listening to things on repeat if I'm in the middle of sort of working. And I think just in terms of talking about cultural experiences as well, I think that a band like Sonic Youth have been really pivotal to me as well. I was talking about, you know, being in Belfast and not being able to see things. Getting into bands like that when I was younger and in Belfast at that time, you know, because of their connections to the art world. Like, I remember the first time I saw Mike Kelly's work was on Sonic Youth album cover.
Yeah.
Raymond Pettibon, same thing, Richard Prince, you know. So actually the kind of introduction to culture, that my engagement with those forms of music, that was pretty important to me as well.
When Sinead O'Connor sadly died last year...
Oh yeah, I forgot to mention
you
Sinead.
Posted something very powerful, I thought, which was that you saw her at the Olympic Ballroom in Dublin, and you said it changed your life.
Yeah, no, I'd forgotten about that one, actually, in terms of pivotal moment. Yeah, I would say that seeing Sinead O'Connor when I was at school, I remember the first time I saw her on TV, we used to go to a leisure centre for PE when we were in our final years at school, and they'd have, you know, it was MTV, and they'd have a screen on in the changing room. And I think it was her song Troy came on, and I remember being like, what's that? And then I remember somebody saying, oh, she's from Glenageary, which is just like up the road. And just literally us all being like, what? How can that be? You know, it's just like, yeah, going to see her. I saw her lots of times. I guess mentally, you know, was very aware of all her ups and downs and all her different phases. And I do think for people of my age, other friends I had at art school, especially one friend of mine who was from very rural Ireland, again, felt like it just totally changed their whole perception of like how young people could be or how they could express themselves. And yeah, I was really very saddened when she died. She was such a troubled person.
Indeed. You mentioned titles in the connection with music. There's one particular title that, apart from anything else, it's a very descriptive title in terms of the way that the work looks, but it's a Glasgow reference. Clearly, it's the Lean Over.
Oh, I didn't. Yeah, yes, it is, of course. Yeah,
which is
Life Without Buildings.
Life Without Buildings.
Yeah, so obviously, yeah, I know Sue, and I know Will Bradley's the drummer in that band, and yeah, so I guess that was from that. Obviously, at the time I titled the work, I would have been very aware of that, but I'd sort of forgotten. But yeah, definitely was relation to that. There's another work called The Narrow Way, which relates to the sort of awful street in Hackney where all the buses used to go down.
Right.
But also which was called The Narrow Way, but also obviously it's a kind of religious idea of the narrow path as well.
Right.
Yeah, that's what I mean. It's not from literature or anything, any of the titles. They're usually just from stuff.
What other media influence your work?
Yeah, live music, singing live music
Right.
influences my work, definitely. And as opposed to listening to music while working or whatever. So yeah, seeing live music really influences my work, or not even influences, that's not the right word. I would say expands my work or allows my work in some ways.
Dance is always really important as
Dance,
well.
yeah. I mean, I love, I'm really interested in expanded practice. When I say live music, I mean, also in the last years, I've gone to see a lot of opera, and I really love that. I love the sort of excess of it, I suppose that's what I like about rock music as well, the sort of excess, And I enjoy seeing dance. Sometimes I wish they'd start singing. But no, I really enjoy the sort of expanded sense of the sort of possibilities for an artwork. And I'm going to do a show at the Fruit Market in 26, and I'm hoping we can do a project with a chamber opera there. Yeah, because I really like the sort of early music. I suppose it's more akin to the sort of, it's not like a band, but that sort of tighter, smaller, more intimate sort of format. Also, it means it's possible to work in a more kind of gallery-based way. So, I mean, that would be something I'd be really interested in doing. And I feel that the relationship between music and art, I never would want to mix the two. Like, I'm not a musical person, definitely, but the idea of the sort of communicative power and the expanded artwork is really interesting to me.
Is there a particular discipline in your daily working life that you see as an essential ritual?
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and there's two really obvious things. I kind of like to swim every morning if I possibly can. I always cycle to work unless I have to go somewhere else. That's really important to me, that sense of the kind of division between I never work at home. Never, ever, ever. I'd rather stay here till really keep the two really separate. So I think that the swimming or cycling here, I don't swim here obviously, but cycling here, swimming, doing that before I start has become increasingly important. And then the other thing, which is forever in my life, is I have to make a list every night. And then I have the list for the day before. And the list isn't even what to do sometimes, but it sort of feels quite necessary. So obviously the list will have, if I have a meeting like with you, but it also might have something about a title or a work or something that came into focus that day. And when I make an exhibition, I always do a kind of like a list of the things I'm thinking about it, like a small drawing of each thing I'm thinking, and then that will progress through the planning of the works, because the works are in conversation with each other. So if you make one, then it will change the other one. When you are in a group show, you're put in a conversation with people, and that's really interesting. But when you make works together, then that kind of how they influence each other is one of the things, that's conversation,
And also, it doesn't have to be a harmonious conversation,
No,
right? It can be
never.
antagonistic.
Well, also, I make work that's very different from each other.
Yeah.
So, yeah, a cacophony.
Indeed. If you could live with just one work of art, what would it be?
So I thought about an easy answer and a hard answer for that. So the easy answer is the Brancusi head, and the hard answer is Laocoon and his sons.
Ah, yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Laocoon and his sons obviously makes me think about your pictures of people holding snakes.
Yeah. Snakes. Yeah.
So that's an homage of sorts.
Yeah, I didn't really think about it when I made the snakes, but yeah, there was a sculpture, one of those kind of quite kitschy Victorian sort of bronze casts after Laocoon in this sort of, one of those kind of stately homes you go and visit on a weekend to get everyone out of the house, with a big kind of garden, and it's called Paris Court House in Wicklow outside Dublin. And yeah, they had this sort of wrestling snake. They had the sort of half-naked ladies, and then they had the guy wrestling the snake. I always preferred the guy wrestling the snake. But yeah, I went to the Vatican Museums to see the original one, because you can see them everywhere. That's also what's so amazing. It's so kind of democratic, that sculpture.
Yeah.
My friend sent me a picture of one that's in, I think, the Art Gallery of New South Wales.
Right.
There's one at the Royal Academy.
Yeah.
There's one in the art school in Dublin.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I went to see the real
ripples as
thing.
well through the art history.
yeah,
You've got,
of course,
Titian
yeah.
made
Yeah,
a
yeah,
painting
yeah,
which was
you
based
know.
on, it's
Yeah,
extraordinary.
and
It's its longevity as an image.
Yeah, and also I have had an ongoing project of making photographs of people holding snakes, so I am really interested in that engagement with that sort of form of life, with the sort of undifferentiated with the differentiated body, you know, and the mythic. It's got the whole lot.
Indeed it has.
Yeah.
Lastly, what is art for?
For me, art's for every day, but I always really like the sort of grandiosity of the Bruce Nauman quote about art, that, art. He says the true artist, I would say the artwork. Maybe you can try to reveal mystical truths. It's for both.
Eva, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Eva Rothschild is at Modern Art in Helmet Row in London from the 6th to the 28th of September. She's also in the group show Still Lives at the Hepworth Wakefield until January 2025. Her solo exhibition at the Fruit Market Gallery in Edinburgh is scheduled for 2026. And that's it for this episode. Please subscribe to A Brush With wherever you're listening, and do give us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. Do also subscribe to our sister podcast, The Week in Art, a deep dive into the latest big art world stories, the top shows and the key issues. That's back on the 6th of September. And please subscribe to The Art Newspaper at theartnewspaper.com. We're on X at Tan Audio and on Facebook, Instagram and Threads. Production, editing and sound design on A Brush With are by David Clack, and the producer is Lewis Jebb. Thanks also to Daniela Hathaway. A big thank you to Eva Rothschild. Thank you for listening. See you next week. Bye for now. A Brush With is sponsored by Bloomberg Connects. Download Bloomberg Connects today and discover cultural institutions on demand.